Hey everybody, Ed here with the Digital Digest, and today I wanted to share a comparison between the Razer Blade 14 on the left and the Dell XPS 15 on the right. These are two of the best laptops money can buy pound for pound here in 2014, and the Razer Blade just got a refresh. The Dell XPS 15, on the other hand, has been on the market for some time, but it did recently get a refresh in processor. But for the purpose of today's review, I will be reviewing literally what I have, which does have each machine has the exact same i7 Intel processor. So let's start off with pricing. Again, these are two of the best machines, and even though this is geared, the Razer 14, towards gamers clearly, this is the 2014 edition with all of its great enhancements, which I really do think round it out and make it one of the best, if not the best laptops out there, side by side with the XPS 15, which, as I mentioned, has been around, but does have far more configuration options, which means much softer pricing and really pricing to suit just about every consumer's need. And unfortunately, it doesn't have the gaming prowess of the Razer, but that's to be expected. So at $2,400, this is the 256 gig SSD option. SSD capacity is your only option when it comes to the Razer Blade. You can start off at 128, the least expensive entry point, go all the way up to 512 gigs, which will, I think, run $26.99. So very expensive, and it certainly blows the pricing for the XPS 15 that's to its right out of the water. You are getting a smaller display. By the way, these have the exact same screen resolution. I'll be getting to that a little bit later, besides having the same processor, at least for this review, as I mentioned. But other than that, 8 gigs of RAM, the i7 4702HQ processor, 6 meg cache, a very good bridge to desktop-like performance, I would say, and that's coming in a 4.5 pound package. You also get, of course, that 3200 by 1200 res display that is touchscreen and really is the best I've ever seen on any laptop. All aluminum build, but very limited ports. It's really a complete contrast to the XPS 15, which is more of a multimedia powerhouse and a one-size-fits-all solution. So both of these devices are unique in terms of pricing. Again, the XPS 15 comes in a lot lower. It starts out at roughly $1,500. The configuration we have here is top of the line for XPS 15, which means it does have the 512 gig SSD as well as 16 gigs of RAM, something you cannot do with the Razer Blade 14, capped at 8 gigs, of RAM soldered on, so you cannot upgrade the RAM. If you're thinking you can, you don't want to. You don't really want to upgrade anything on this machine. It will void your warranty. When it comes to the XPS 15, though, the pricing originally for this model was $2,400, $2,500. Now it's as low as $2,000, maybe even less. And as I mentioned, they have refreshed the processor to the 2712. But the actual performance difference is negligible. So in terms of pricing, you've got a pretty solid idea. You're getting more for less with the Dell, but you're also getting less when it comes to the customer service side, which I'll get to a little bit later. In terms of specifications, the resolution on each screen exactly the same. As I mentioned, 3200 by 1800 res. But the XPS 15 has a 15.5-inch roughly display, so larger than the 14-inch you're getting over here. The XPS 15 display, I can tell you, is very good. You can check out any of my other previous reviews, gaming demos of the XPS 15 to get an idea of the quality of the display. It is excellent. However, it does not match up with the the Razer Blade 14, and that's not because of pixel density, even though that is in the favor of the I keep saying XPS, of the Razer Blade 14. It has more to do with the actual display type. Beyond that, though, they share the same processor, as I mentioned before. You have more RAM, 16 gigs here on the Dell, only 8 on the Razer Blade. In terms of connectivity, they both have dual band Wi-Fi, AC capable, of course. You do have NFC on the Dell, something you're not going to see on the Razer Blade, and that's because, again, the Razer Blade is a gaming-centric enthusiast device. It is not really made for the one-size-fits-all solution that the XPS 15 represents. But the key difference that you're really paying for with the Razer, beyond the branding and excellent build quality, is the gaming capability. And the NVIDIA onboard solution is the GTX 870 M with 3 gigs of RAM, which really will allow you to play just about everything at 1080p, on ultra, set to high, no problem. Not every game, but a lot of current titles. And that's something that with the XPS 15, you simply aren't going to be able to do because it isn't a gaming laptop. So even though it shares the same processor, same screen resolution, even has more RAM, and a larger SSD for less money, and performance, by the way, on the SSDs is comparable, by the way. I mean, I've been using both machines long enough to tell you that. You are simply not going to be able to use that NVIDIA 750M with 2 gigs of RAM to do really much of anything. So that's something you should know immediately. Gaming on the XPS 15 is possible, but it's far from ideal. Whereas here on the Razer, you literally are getting a gaming laptop stuffed into what is, or used to be, a very small, if not even Ultrabook-esque form factor. Granted, it's 4.5 pounds, which Ultrabooks are about half that weight, about 3 pounds, even less, but I'm talking about years ago. So let's take a look at the actual laptop keyboards. All aluminum build with the Razer Blade. The XPS 15 has an aluminum lid, but the actual balance of the laptop is a carbon fiber body on the bottom, and that's why it weighs in at 4.5 pounds, even though it's larger, substantially larger, both in footprint, not just screen real estate, than the Razer Blade 14. Now, in terms of keyboards, you can see there is a stark difference, and I say that because there's a lot more room on this wrist pad, I will call it, on the XPS 15, but also you've got the benefit, in my opinion, I do prefer having the actual left and right mouse click buttons here on the trackpad, on the touchpad. A lot of people will prefer this standard that Apple has implemented and has been granted the standard by, basically everyone, every manufacturer. Razer, bucking the trend, sticking with what they think is optimal for the experience that they want to cater to. I just think it works better overall in terms of just practical functionality. And that's not to take anything away from the experience on the touchpad here on the XPS 15. So both are really good. Both keyboards are very good. Backlighting, very even on both machines. You'll see that to some degree right now. Some people will not be in love with the green here, but that is part of the brand. You're not going to escape the green branding of the Razer Blade 14. But in terms of build quality, I have to say there's no question that the Razer Blade is the much more solid machine. I mean, it's the heavier machine technically just because they are, again, different sizes, and yet the blade weighs the same amount. So you're getting something a little bit more weighty, a little bit more dense. It is a fingerprint magnet. You will have to clean this if that bothers you, and it's going to be very difficult. The Dell will also collect a lot of fingerprints on this the pad that they've wrapped around the piece of aluminum that sits on top of all of the internals here. And those fingerprints are bad, but it won't happen anywhere else on the machine. Whereas with the Razer Blade, the fingerprints are going to happen everywhere, and they're pretty much permanent. You're not going to have that problem with the aluminum lid on the XPS 15, and you can always wipe that down if you do actually have any sort of issue with it. So it's really not an issue as far as I'm concerned, and that's something I wanted to make everyone aware of, is that with the Razer Blade, if the fingerprints bother you, be prepared, because that's really the only downside to the Blade, in my opinion. But you've seen the keyboards. They're both really solid. You're not going to have a problem with either. They're both top-notch. They should be for the price. As I said, though, build quality does go to the Blade outside of the fingerprints. But when it comes to specifications and pricing, as I mentioned before, the XPS 15 kills almost everything on the market. I mean, the 15 has Displayport, HDMI, no Displayport here on the Razer Blade, no SD card slot. You have that on the XPS 15. Razer decided that gamers do not need an SD card slot. This is part of the philosophy of what the Blade represents. So if you're not a gamer in many ways, it isn't really meant for you. I mean, you shouldn't be paying this premium for this laptop. You should be buying something like the XPS 15. That is, unless you're worried about Dell's customer support, which again, I'm saving for the end of this. And I will give my personal opinion because I have dealt with both companies, so I do have some insight on that. A longtime customer of Dell, not as long, clearly, of Razer. They haven't been around that long making laptops. But Dell has, again, pricing and general performance in its favor. As I lift this up, I will tell you it actually feels lighter than the Razer Blade simply because it has more surface area for that 4.5 pounds of distribution. So it is much larger, though. Don't for a moment think it's not. But you can see some of the ports that I've been mentioning right there. And whether it's the SD card slot, the 2 USB ports, or if I flip it around, we've got even more. And these are all things that you're just not going to get with the Razer Blade, even though you're spending a lot more to get technically about the same, granted a much better display and better graphics card, but otherwise a wash in internal hardware. So there you can see the HDMI out, the Displayport. For those of you wondering why Displayport is valuable, if you want to daisy chain and set this up with multiple displays, it's definitely more flexible right now than HDMI, and that's just a matter of fact. And having two outputs on here is an even greater benefit. You have another 2 USB ports, and then right there is your headphone jack, as well as the lights, the LEDs that will light up to let you know where your battery is at internally. It's a good time to point out battery life difference, because that is another major difference with this machine. The XPS 15 does outclass the Razer Blade when it comes to battery life, and a lot of that has to do with the physical battery size in the laptop, as well as the graphics card difference is what I'm going to point to, and also Razer not really being interested so much in battery life, but focusing on the fact that this laptop is going to be able to hang when it comes to gaming, and it can. The XPS 15 is really not what I would recommend for gaming. It can do things, but it's far from ideal for a gaming solution. The Blade, on the other hand, and you're going to see the fingerprints collect as I at least attempt to lift this thing up without damaging anything. And it's already happening. Basically, I do prefer the design here over the XPS 15. It is unique, no question about it. I mean, show me another laptop that looks like it. You got your green USB port there, HDMI out, your Kensington lock just like we had on the other laptop. Really nothing at the front other than the LED to let you know where you're at with battery life again. And then on the left-hand side, that's where we have the power port for charging, 2 USB ports, and the headphone jack. So that's it. I mean, this is as minimalistic as a laptop can possibly be. And the build is uniform across the entire machine. That's part of what is going to make people inherently compare it to the MacBook Pro. And both of these machines are in line with pricing for the MacBook Pro. Of course, the XPS 15 isn't anymore because it's come down so much, but it will still inherently be compared to it. And the fact that both of these have touchscreens also makes them, in my opinion, inherently superior to anything Apple is making right now. They're just way behind in the game and still selling, basically marketing. And if you do prefer their OS, then there's a reason to continue buying. But if you don't have any preference for OS, then the hardware these days really isn't as close as I'd like it to be. I want to see more competitive nature, I'll say, from Apple when it comes to the MacBook Pro. I think everyone does. And so here you've got really two very similar experiences. The key difference is really, as I mentioned, build quality, customer support, and, do fingerprints bother you? And whether or not you really plan on gaming. If you need to game, you're not going to do better than this. And for those of you that are concerned by the fact that it's capped at 8 gigs of RAM, I know where you're coming from. I'm going to be using the machine exclusively more so for video editing than anything else. So I loved the fact that the XPS 15 had 16 gigs of RAM at a more palatable price than the Razer Blade with 8 gigs of RAM. But when you wrap up the entire package of what a laptop should be in 2014 in terms of quality, peace of mind, and again, that customer service, the Razer Blade, you are getting what you pay for in build quality. I know a lot of people say that about Apple. They don't realize that, Foxconn makes a lot of other things that aren't high quality. But they have built a reputation on quality and customer service, and I can't take away the customer service end of things from them, and that's what Razer Blade has learned. You call, you're going to get someone that is going to be able to help you. I'll leave it at that. Whereas with Dell, you'll be making a call to customer service and you can get passed around 10 times. re-explaining all of your details. We've all been there at one point as a Dell customer or another. And I think since the company has gone private, things have gotten worse, frankly. When it was public, and this is not me ragging on Dell, it's, again, my literal experience, they've just become a chop shop, and things have gotten bad. And if I was a first-time buyer and I had a problem with a Dell system, I would probably never repurchase. With Razer, on the other hand, I think you've got a much better shot at being a satisfied customer. Granted, you're paying for it, no question about it. I can tell you in terms of bugs or known issues with each machine, the Razer Blade really very few. The XPS 15, on the other hand, and users, watchers of this video, but users of the XPS 15 itself who have commented in the past on my other updates, know about the coil whine issue. For those of you unaware of that, the machine makes noise, essentially. A coil whine issue does exist. Does everyone have it? I think pretty much. It's more of a matter of whether everyone hears it and how abrasive they actually find it to be. For me, not so bad. In fact, I hear it on a lot of machines. And I know some people will say, well, I have laptops that don't have it. Yeah, there are ones that exist, but the majority do have it. So while it is a flaw in Dell's manufacturing, Dell hasn't done anything about it. I don't know that they actually will. They've said they have, or they will, in their own user forums, but I don't think I've seen any follow-through as of yet. And since I don't work for them, not paid by them in any form or fashion, or by anyone for that matter, it's something that, for me personally, I look at the Dell and I say, coil whine aside, what else do we have to worry about? Well, what I mentioned before, the customer support. If you have any other kinds of issues, which I've seen some with the XPS 15, the screen having pressure points, you know, the screen not necessarily having the molding done perfectly in terms of the seal, there are a lot of things. And Dell just, the quality control has gotten worse and worse year after year, unfortunately. And so that's part of the compromise you make when you get that deal. You know, you're paying the lower price to get such great hardware that here you're paying a substantial premium for, especially because of the gaming capability, of course. Let's not leave that out. That's one of the better mobile chips you're going to get. But gaming aside, you're not going to face any of the technical problems in build here with the Razer Blade. So there's something to be said for the premium you're paying in general. Also, as I said, when you get on the phone with Razer Tech support specifically for the Blade 14, as opposed to the XPS so-called hotline, you are going to speak to one person, deal with one person, and that's the end of the story. You know, their warranty calls for, I think, two-day air back and forth on the laptop for any kind of repairs or replacement. Dell, it's a circus. That's me being polite, frankly. And you may get a Dell that's perfect out of the box. I think most Dell customers know you may have to go through 3. I mean, that's how bad it's really gotten. So there is a compromise, like I said, with the XPS 15 you are clearly making, and I'm not going to do any more speculating on how we got here, but I think I've done enough as is. But when it comes to performance for your money, you still, there's so much to like here. In fact, in many ways, I prefer this machine over the Razer. I mean, technically, all of those ports that I was just showing really do make this the better all-in-one 4.5-pound machine. And the display, even though it isn't as good as the Blade, it's really close. And it is bigger. I mean, there's no question. I don't like giving up the 15.5-inch display here. It's definitely nicer to watch 4K video, even if it's downsampled to the native 3200 by 1800 res that we have on either of these displays. But the display here is just gorgeous. Let me go ahead, power them on, and just show you. The screen is dimmed, though, on the XPS. Actually, no, it's at full brightness. It's just dim now, of course. And I would have to bring it out. It's got adaptive on. But they're different display types. And I mean, this isn't going to look good for the XPS 15, but you have to see these in person. That's what it comes down to. I have no other way of putting it. You can see how vibrant the color is there. It's outstanding. And there's a lot more bezel here, I would say, than with the XPS 15. Speakers, by the way, I can't believe I left that out this whole time. The speakers are actually in a better position here. They're underneath wrapped around the chassis of the XPS 15, so I much prefer the audio, believe it or not, even though there's a lot less bass, much more natural in my opinion. And the XPS generally was a champ when it came to sound quality. It is loud, don't get me wrong, it'll get much louder than the Razer, but it almost seems like with the Razer, they respected the reality of what you should get out of speakers coming out of a laptop. For those of you wondering about heat when it comes to each of these laptops, I can tell you that the Razer Blade 14 will run hotter than the XPS 15, and that's simply because of the actual design and build material. The XPS 15 has that in its favor because it doesn't have a metal or aluminum body on the bottom. It has a carbon fiber material, so that simply will not get as warm to the touch as the all-aluminum build that the Razer Blade 14 sports. But there you see the brightness right there. You get a pretty good idea of the quality there. So the XPS 15 is far from being a slouch. Don't for a moment think that this display can't hang. It is definitely, I mean, one of the best in the business, and that has to do with the quality, but the fact that they made the panel so thin, that's how those pressure points will happen. You may not notice them, but I'm giving you, full details on what to expect. With the Razer Blade, the only thing I keep telling you're going to expect is a high price and a fingerprint magnet. So those are two things that some people will not need to really compare, and what I've said is already enough. I mean, once you've crossed the $2,000 threshold for a laptop, I would hope that you know what your threshold includes in terms of performance and what you expect to get for your money. So again, it's a matter of budget and how much patience you have at the end of the day, I think, and whether or not you want the gaming experience. If budget is no object, I would go with the Razer Blade. I'm personally going with it just because I've had enough of Dell and their customer service and the fact that they really don't stand behind their product like they did once upon a time. And I know this because, again, I'm a longtime customer, and it's a shame because the XPS 15 in so many ways represents much of what I think the industry's been waiting for, and in terms of cost, that's a great benefit that it's not, it still is less than just about everything out there. I mentioned it even has NFC, which is another thing I'll be dropping with this. But despite all of those features and the great screen, when it comes to the QC and the customer service, it's enough to make you run. The Razer Blade, I still haven't seen it have an issue. I mentioned battery life before, and I never told you what the true difference was. I just said the Dell was better, so I'll revisit that now. With the Dell, I would say with screen brightness up, you're looking at 6-7 hours. Depending on what you're doing, you could squeeze out 8. Dell claims 12 because they're full of it. The Razer Blade, they're not lying. They're saying 6 hours, and you know what? That's what you're going to get. Can you get more? Can you get 7 or 8? Depending on what you do, maybe you can squeeze it out, but Razer's not lying about their specifications. Not that I'm saying Dell is. Everyone in the industry quotes higher numbers because they do it based on test patterns they do to drain the battery rather than real-world experience, which makes no sense to this day. And maybe one day more companies will do what Razer does and tell you the actual battery life. But as it stands, Dell still has that in its favor. So that is another thing. I'm not taking it away from Dell. It is a pro, and again, if you don't care about gaming, the XPS 15 is a fantastic machine as long as you are ready to make that deal with their customer service. So another thing probably to take into mind is, a third-party warranty. I recommend it only because, again, what I've mentioned, once you're past that first year, dealing with another company may be better. But then again, to get parts from Dell and things like that, that's again part of this compromise. Things get sticky, and that's not to say that Razer is going to be perfect down the road. They have to stay in business. I'm not kidding when I say that. But if the biggest thing preventing you from buying the Blade is the 8 gigs of RAM, let me remind you that they looked at it from a gaming perspective, and considering the onboard gaming card, the integrated card, has 3 gigs of its own RAM, it can hang. So they looked at it like, this doesn't need to have 16 gigs of RAM. Personally, I would have preferred it, as I mentioned, for video editing, Photoshop, have all those things running at once. You need that extra RAM. The average user does not need it, but anyone who's actually planning to utilize the true power of both of these machines 16 gigs of RAM is preferable even here in 2014, but you can easily make the argument that 8 gigs is more than enough. 2 years from now, I don't know what it'll be. It all depends. I mean, I think things generally get leaner, but there's no question all of the hardware companies would be out of business if they didn't continue to update hardware, despite the fact that maybe software is now not keeping up with it yet again. So it's all a matter of your outlook on the future for hardware and software. I've given you mine. I think 8 gigs of RAM is going to last for quite a while, especially for what laptops will be able to do. But the XPS 15 already set a standard for its pricing, but again, with the headaches that I've mentioned, whether its build or just the people you'll be talking to. So it's a matter of, again, pricing and patience. You know, what do you have the tolerance for? And do you need some of the things that the XPS 15 has? You know, a lot of customers would not give up the SD card, the extra USB ports, the extra Displayport out that this machine does not have, whether it can game or not. Then again, the gamer, they're only going to be looking at this. Otherwise, you'll be stepping up to 17-inch beasts, you know, massive machines. And that's what both of these give you the capability of, at least not in gaming with the XPS 15, but otherwise everything there. Desktop replacement capability in 4.5-pound packages with actual battery life that isn't awful. By the way, gaming battery life here is awful. I mean, about an hour. But that's to be expected because gaming is, especially with this machine, at the quality that it can game, is intensive. I mean, it is the thing that will kill a battery quicker than anything else, especially with the screen you have here. You will also shy away in most games, unless they're older titles, from running at native 3200 by 1800 resolution. That's just not going to play out well. But hopefully this video has given those of you who are trying to decide between these two laptops a pretty good idea of at least what my experience has been. I know I didn't demo web browsing because that's not what this video was about. It's about which is the better product, giving you information, trying to equip you with as much as you possibly can know about each of these machines respectively before you lay out over $2,000 for either one of them. And of course you can go with a lesser build on the 15, as I've mentioned over and over again. You don't have to buy this model. They start much lower, but expect the same problems that I mentioned with any build because they're being made in the same factory and to the same QC standards. And for me personally, it's been a tough choice, but at the end, as I said, the complete package in the Blade 14 2014 edition is just a better machine overall. And because I did go with the top spec XPS 15, they were close enough in price that to me the difference was less of a compromise than even what I was giving up with the 15. But at the end of the day, just the performance, the display, and build quality, and for the fourth time, the company standing behind it, it's enough that I can't recommend the XPS 15 unless your budget confines you to it. And that really does sum up my thoughts on most of Dell's products these days, unfortunately. So while they remain competitive, or at least seem to, for me, the well is running dry. But still very good machine, just not as good as the Razer, even with the Razer's pricing and cap on RAM. Any questions or comments, please feel free to post them. And of course, as usual, please feel free to subscribe. Later.